to the Tough Fish Show. I am so excited to bring to you Eileen Cook. Eileen, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's exciting.
I am so excited you're here, and I would love for you to start with, how did you get into writing?
Oh, well, I think the writing is always an interesting question to ask people how they got there. So I can honestly say there are two moments I know it happened for me. So the first one that I remember is I was about 11 or 12, and I used to go to the library every week with my parents. And I had, as usual, checked out a big stack of books, and my mother was taking too long. So I wandered into the adult part of the library, and I picked up a book that looked interesting to me called Salem's Lot. So I was about 11 at the time, and I, for whatever reason, thought it looked like a great book. So I added it to my stack of Nancy Drews. And the librarian took a look at that, and she said, "Oh, no, you can't read that. That's nasty. It's a nasty, nasty book." Which clearly she didn't know children, because as soon as she said that, my mild interest in the book went all the way to level 10. I had to read it. And so my mom was summoned from some dark corner of the library, and my mom took a look at it, and she said, "You can read it if you want. It's going to be really scary." And I remember feeling insulted, because I was a very mature 11 years old, and I knew the difference between make-believe and real life. So I wanted to read it. And of course, anyone who's read Stephen King knows it scared the pants off me. It terrified me. I think I slept with the light on for months after that time period.
Aww. But
But what I remember in those nights laying awake, waiting for the vampires to come, is that I knew it was made up. Like, I knew it was all pretend. And yet I felt this real emotion. And I just thought, that's magical. And I want to be able to do that. Not that I wanted necessarily to write scary books. I mean, I write murder mysteries, not scary. But I wanted to be able to do that, to make something up that someone else knew was made up, and yet have them feel something real. So that's the first time I remember it. In second grade, apparently, I'd done some homework assignment where we were supposed to practice our handwriting, and I made mine into a full story. And the teacher wrote at the bottom, "I'm sure someday you'll be an author, Eileen." And my parents actually saved that for me. You know, parents save weird things like your baby teeth, which is kind of creepy, and some of your homework assignments. And so actually, when I published my very first book, which would be much, much, much later, my parents basically had that framed up for me, and I still have it. Hangs on the wall. So my second grade teacher was very smart, or psychic.
I love that so much. I love that that although, to your point, Salem's Lot was scary,
Yes.
and you knew it, but you could appreciate it and recognize how that's amazing to have created such a feeling, such a visceral reaction to it, really.
Well, and I still find that my ex-husband was an engineer, so we were probably not well suited from the get-go. But I remember oftentimes I'd be laying in bed and sobbing over a book, and he would be like, "No one really died." And it would be that moment of like, well, I know that, but I feel that loss. I feel that. So for me, that was just something I always loved, that magic that came with books and stories. So I always wrote. But I had two very practical parents who were like, that's sort of saying you want to be an author to my parents was sort of like saying you kind of wanted to be a fairy or a princess. Like, it's a nice idea, but it's not a job. So I got my undergraduate degree in English, which my dad would prove to be correct, because there's not a lot of jobs in just being well-read, sadly, especially in the Midwest, which is where I lived at the time. So I would end up going back to school for counseling psychology. In particular, I work with people with catastrophic injuries or illness was my specialty.
Wow.
And I thought that was really interesting, just in terms of, I do think for everyone, every experience you have is adding to your writer toolkit, because you're meeting people, you're having experiences. And for me, the chance of working with people who, most of the time, anyone I was seeing, their life was in a very bad place. They'd had some kind of catastrophic incident. I worked with people who were burned, victims, paraplegia, quadriplegia, head injury. So their whole life had been kind of upended. But in some ways, that's what we're doing in fiction. Even if we're not putting someone through an accident, we're usually putting them through one of the most traumatic experiences in their life. So I learned so much about how people cope and how some people really resound and are resilient and some people aren't. So all those experiences were adding up. And then slowly but surely, I was still writing and still sending things out. And eventually one of those would sell.
That is awesome. And because when I'm, to your point, yes, you did learn about how different people cope, what that looks like, the resiliency, or, basically that journey is not linear. So you saw the ebbs and flows, the setbacks, the triumphs and so forth. But in the same breath, that kind of information helps to really create empathy in writing, because being able to understand somebody else, because as an editor, as a developmental editor, I look for opportunities I call them happy developmental opportunities, when I think that the characters need a little bit of extra something. And I call them that, developmental opportunities. But what you're describing is also that appreciation of saying, what else could be going on? How else can I add to that tension, develop that character, so that there's also subtle tension and subtle conflict. It's not just in your face of, I've deliberately put you in a big problem. It's also the nuances that get there. And your background sounds like it just lended itself naturally to help create that.
Well, and I'm really interested in, why do people do what they do? And everyone has a reason for that. And it's not going to be the same reason that you do it. But I do I teach creative writing. And certainly when I'm talking to my students, I'm like, the reason your character does something cannot be because that's what you need them to do for the plot. Because they don't know they're in a story. It's very unfortunate for them. They don't understand that they are imaginary. So if you want the reader to believe that they're real, then they have to have a good reason for doing what they're doing. Now, that doesn't mean it's a good decision or that it's an objectively a good reason to do something, but it makes sense to them. And the way it makes sense is from where we come from, right? So again, and if you'll excuse me for a moment, I'm going off to counseling. But again, because that's what I worked in, one of the things we looked at was something called rational emotive therapy. And no one has to worry, there will not be a quiz at the end of this podcast. You don't have to remember that. But what you should remember from that is the theorists put forward this idea of ABC. So A is the activating event, B is your belief about that event, and C is the consequence of that belief. So if you walk into a room and you see the person that you've had a crush on hugging someone else, that is the activating event. Your belief about that event may be like, like I thought he liked me and clearly he loves someone else. That's your belief. And then C is the consequence of, you may then say, well, then I'm not going to see that person anymore. So cue every romantic comedy you've ever seen, because of course the activating event may be that that was his cousin or his sister or someone else. But your belief about it is what kicks the story off. And we do that over and over in our lives all the time. There's what happens, but there's the meaning that we put on it. So if you're a teen girl and you come downstairs for the big dance and your mom says, oh, are you going to wear that? What you hear may be completely different, right? You hear, are you going to wear that? And it comes out with all of those things. If you're writing murder mystery, the activating event is a clue, but your belief about that leads your investigation in a direction that may or may not be right. So I think there's just a lot for me that's fascinating around how each of us sees the world in our own unique way, based on our own experiences. And we take that into future decisions. And so do our characters.
Absolutely. I love how you described that. That was beautiful. And you're right, because you want to, when you have those characters and they're moving through whatever that is, yes, the author's thinking about the plot, but to your point, the characters, they're going through that. And ideally, the writer's following what the characters are doing. And if they deviate a little bit, that's okay. You can still kind of, if you need this certain event to occur, you can still get them there. They'll just get there a little differently, but you're honoring what they're showing, how they're showing up, and their voices become louder. You get to know them because of that. So how do you, so when you have the events, the ABCs, I love that so much, then how do you continue to encourage exploring those characters? For instance, going back to the creative writing space, like how do you help those characters to keep moving through and like really listening to them to tell the story, their story?
Well, I think it's two parts. So the first is really understanding where they come from, because all of our belief structures come from someplace, right? And this is, we can get into our nature nurture discussion here. Everyone's like, I thought this was a writing podcast, and now suddenly we're in psychology 101 all over again. But people, like, those beliefs come from our experiences with our family. They come from, if you've been hurt before, then how you react in a situation is different than someone who maybe hasn't had a big betrayal in their past history. So I think one of the best things that someone can do is really take the time to understand what happened to your character before the book ever opened. So I spend a lot of time thinking, this is where they are on page 1, but they didn't come fully formed on page 1 any more than a person pops into being at 35 or 48 or 22, right? They had a whole history before the point that you met them. So just understand your characters had a whole history before you met them. And if you want to understand where they're coming from in terms of what decisions they're making now, you have to understand what happened in the past. So I'm a big believer in taking a lot of time to really think about that, to do some diary entries from their perspective. I will often ask people to do, when I was a counselor, I would always ask people to do a timeline for me. So I would say, like, if this start of the timeline is birth and this end of the timeline is today, can you just make me a list of what major events happened in your life before I've met you? And what was interesting to me was two things. One, what did they see as momentous events in their life? Because those are not always the same for different people, right? And then it was understanding the story of that, because then that let me understand, oh, that might be why they're making these choices. And I would also always ask people, like, if it's a positive event, put it above the line. And if it was a negative thing that happened to you, put it below the line. And the second thing that was fascinating to me is, what do people see as positive? So I've seen everything above and below the line. I've seen divorce above the line. I've seen divorce below the line. I've seen having children above the line. And I've seen people put it below the line, where they'll say, like, I love my kids, but once I had kids, I stopped doing, my dream. I stopped doing this, or, I got locked into an unhappy marriage. And to me, it's interesting how they make sense of that world. And so for me, when you start having that curiosity, and that's what I would tell people, like, what a great job we have, right? Like, what a wonderful thing to do, because I can tell you, when you're counseling real people, it's different, because they have real problems and they don't always make the changes you want. But your characters, you can influence that, and you can decide, kind of where they want to go, as long as you're listening to them.
I love that so much. Now, if we can switch just a little bit from character into setting or even plot, let's like if you wouldn't mind kind of talking about how those two pieces, how to consider those pieces as you're writing, so that the characters do show up, and that they're strong characters, but yet not neglecting a plot and not neglecting the setting to help make that happen. Because it's not just all dialogue. Dialogue is awesome. Description of characters is wonderful, but there needs to be other parts, and that amplifies the character even more so, if you are willing to look at those type of elements to help strengthen the character.
Well, it's so funny because I teach creative writing, and last night we were talking about setting. So I I am very interested in this particular topic because I think too often what people mistake is they mistake setting for stage dressing. So for example, if I was going to describe my office, flat description of setting would be like, it has blue walls. There are windows on 3 sides. There is a glass table. It's just a listing of things and space. And that's not interesting for a reader. It's just, I mean, unless they're fascinated by interior design, which I mean, maybe 0.0001% are. What is interesting to me is the intersection between character and setting. That's my dog that you hear crying.
Okay, we
For the
have cats.
record. She keeps an eye on all things. So for me, in terms of that intersection with character, is why does the character Eileen have the things in her office that she does? And that gives you a chance to maybe give some backstory. So I turn and I say, oh, you see that horse statue? Oh, that came when we were on a trip to Italy. And perhaps that gives me an opportunity to give some backstory. It also lets you get into tone and feel, because I could say, describe the office. And again, you use that same flat description. But then I would say, now draw a line and imagine the office, but I am really sad, right? What things would I notice? Right. So maybe now I pick out that same horse thing, but it reminds me of my divorce. Right. So it allows me to, you're adding to that, and how you describe things will change. If this was a horror novel, you would describe the space differently, that it's open and vulnerable. There's windows on 3 sides where anyone could look in.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking of setting as adding to your story, right? It's not just background, it's a part of it. Everything, what we notice, show of hands for all the writers in the room. When you get onto public transit or you go to the airport, how many people notice if someone else is reading a book? And if so, what are they reading? Right? We notice that because that's who we are as people.
Mm-hmm.
15-year-old boy, maybe not notice that at all, but he will notice that, oh, that guy's wearing the most coolest kicks ever, right? Whereas I just feel hip that I know that they're sometimes called kicks and they're sneakers. Like, I'm just impressed that I know that, right? But I would notice another thing, or they might notice, oh, they can kind of hear someone's music on the headphones, right? So it'll drop them into that. And it's important to understand that all of those setting details, especially when you add sensory details, that's what makes the story come alive for the reader. If they are feeling that, oh, the bus seat is a little sticky, right? And like, oh, what did that come from? That just drops them into it. Or, oh, there's the smell of, at the airport, there's a Cinnabon, right? And someone is pumping out that smell of Cinnabon. The interesting thing about the brain is, if I tell you the smell of Cinnabon, the part of your brain would light up in an MRI that is the same part of your brain that would light up if you actually smelled it. So when you're giving your readers those kinds of details, you're lighting up the parts of their brain that feel that, and that will make them feel more grounded in the story. So setting is so important.
I love that you just said that. It makes them feel grounded. Yes, you're lighting things up in their imagination and being drawn in, but what it does is that they feel like they can be in that space versus feeling like a floating body of sorts. Yes. or feeling like, what's happening around me? What's really going on, and feeling off? Because even in a story like a thriller or a suspense where you want them to feel off, you still need to ground them to be able to handle the room, to then handle the elements of fear that you bring in. So yes, I love that, how you just described that. Oh, so, and you made me hungry now. Thank you.
I made myself hungry too. I mean, I think it's just so important to understand that it's that feeling grounded that puts the reader in it. And if you're not doing that, what you feel is distant and you don't feel a part of it. And that's when you run the risk that someone just puts the book down, which is what we don't want, right? And we've all had that where you're reading a book and you put it down because there's something better on Netflix or because you want to throw a load of laundry in, but you don't feel that compulsion to get back to it. And I don't know if anyone else has had this, but you're finally like, I'm just going to take it back to the library or, toss it on the used book pile because you just don't feel pulled into that world. And that's what you need to do with setting. And plot is the opposite side of you got to give somebody a place to go. And plot is the journey. Having a story where it's like, this is Eileen wandering through her day-to-day life. Like, I'm just going to warn you all, I am so boring. I live alone. I talk way too much to my dogs as if they're going to answer back, right? I tend to eat the same thing. I have a spinach salad for lunch almost every day because I've gotten into the habit. It's very boring and no one wants to read about that. Plot has purpose. It's not characters just wandering around. We're picking a very specific moment in that character's life to illustrate something. So there needs to be friction or conflict.
Mm-hmm.
If it's just like Eileen gets up, she has her cup of tea, she writes, it's time for spinach salad, we walk the dogs, we watch some Netflix, we read a book, we go to bed, well, same thing tomorrow. No one is going to want to read that. It has to be that intersection of where you upend that character's life in some way, shape, or form. That doesn't have to be an explosion or a murder or, sometimes I talk to people who are like, but I'm not writing a thriller or I'm not writing, a dystopian tale where like, oh, looks like the moon's going to crash into the earth, right? So they're like, I don't know what to do, but something has happened for that person that has interrupted their life. And that's the ticket to the journey that you've sold to the reader, right? So if it's a sports book and it's about the plucky hero who really wants to win the Olympics, then we know this book is going to come to an end where he either wins the Olympics or doesn't win the Olympics, right? If it's a romance and you meet that dreamy somebody on, at the airport, we know this book is going to come to an end when they either find true love or it all blows up, right? But we have to have that journey. That's what the reader is buying into. That's why they're there. They're not there for a slice of life. That's poetry in many cases, which is beautiful and stunning. And, but it's a different art form. If you're writing a story, it has to have a plot and the plot must go somewhere.
And when I was thinking of what was running through my mind when you first said, like, it doesn't have to be like this earth-shattering kaboom kind of thing, was going back to the rom-com idea. Was actually what came to my mind was in Legally Blonde, when Elle is told, she's like, I do. And he's like, yes, I'll marry you. And he's like, no, I'm dumping you. Her world just got upended. And it wasn't crazy, but it was enough of a change in her world to cause her to spiral and then figure out what she's going to do. But that was a big change for her. And it didn't physically hurt her. Well, it did in her heart, but it didn't physically hurt her as though it was, something else happening in the world. But it was enough of a change for her. And that's the whole point, is what happened with the character. And then to your point, the journey. So yeah,
it feels like life or death. Like, I think that's what we need to understand is, and I love Legally Blonde is such a great example, but, in that moment when she's like, I do, and he's like, I don't, what has died in that moment is the future that she planned, right? Like, what died for her are the kids. Like, she's already named the baby. She's already lost the house that they were going to live in, just burned down. Like, we can say, well, all that's imaginary and in her head. True, but she was counting on that. In that moment, it feels like life or death.
Yeah.
And that's what I think people need to go back to, is when our characters have a big change. Yeah, they might be taking the ring back to Mordor and it's life or death. And are they going to survive that? But you might be writing a YA novel about a character whose best friend dropped them to go be a part of the popular group. And that's like having to navigate high school without your BFF is as
Yeah.
scary as going into Mordor, right? Like if you're
Yes.
16 and you're like, wait a minute, that was my best friend and now she's not my best friend anymore. Everything is just as scary. And for the reader, it will feel that because let's be honest, most of us don't have lives where we're, you know, hijacking planes or, you know, having to, you know, jettison off on our spaceship and, you know, survive on Mars or, you know, most of us have quiet lives, but they're no less emotionally fulfilling. They're no more or less, you know, the moment that you say I do and it is true love, that is a beautiful moment. And you know, if you take something away from someone, that's a death. It's a
Mhm.
death of an idea or a dream or a hope. And someone has to rebuild from that. And that's the exciting part.
Yes, I love how you just described that because you're right. It is when you really are intimate with that character, you really understand that character, where they're coming from, and you get that character is looking at you going, "Are you kidding? I have to go and do this without my best friend? Or what's going to happen when I go to that big school assembly, but I don't get to sit with my best friend because now my best friend is over with the popular crowd and that's going to be awkward. And oh my gosh, I don't want to go anymore." You can really feel the angst for that character. And then you feel for the character. And then when you see what happens in that space, it's heartbreaking and the tension is there, the friction is there. So yes,
Because
I
we've all been there. I mean, that's the thing to remember with books is it's a universal experience. So maybe your best friend didn't dump you in high school, but there's been at least some point in your life where you had to navigate a new space. So as you're watching that character go through it, you're having that moment, right? You may be reading a murder mystery and you've never had to solve a murder mystery, right? But you've been in a space where you've had some of those same feelings and emotions. And that's what we're tapping into as writers,
Mhm.
is that idea that we've all have these universal emotions. We're all afraid of abandonment. We're all afraid of rejection. We're all afraid of death. We all love love. We love to be loved. We love to be touched. We love all of those things are universal. So, you know, your character has their own unique, you know, maybe they're going through the Civil War and dealing with some, you know, the loss of their home, or, you know, you're writing a book about someone in the Ukraine currently, you're doing a modern take on it, but someone else has had that experience in a small, very different way. And if you write it correctly, they tap into it, and the empathy they have for the character becomes the celebration they feel for themselves. When the character finds love, when the character reaches safety, when the character rebuilds their home or finds a new best friend, we have that like, yes moment because it reminds us that we can do it. I mean,
Yes.
I talk to a lot of writers about the journey to publication when we talk about journeys is very fraught, right? Think of it as your own personal journey into Mordor sometimes, right? Where you're going to get knocked down and you're going to feel like you can't do it. And hopefully you have, you know, a good friend like Frodo did. So you have a good Sam who's telling you like, you know, I love you and I know you can do it and all of those things. And we need stories to remind ourselves that we're going to be okay. I saw a wonderful thing on Facebook yesterday. And I would give credit, but I don't think it had who said it. But someone's like, we think of hope as kind of this fluffy, light thing, right? Like this wispy, beautiful thing. But like hope is a scrapper, right? Like hope is the person who's spitting out a bloody tooth before marshaling themselves to get back up and brushing grit off their knees. Hope is about rising up again. And as writers, that's a skill we need to have because writing and publication is a lot of getting knocked down. And, you know, I wish I could say it wasn't. But one, no one else is going to like you as a writer if you don't have a few of those stories in your back pocket about the time you got a horrible rejection letter or the time you know, something didn't sell. So it's about getting back up because that's what life is no one goes through life unscathed. No one. So when we read about characters who get knocked down, who have everything taken away from them, who lose love, who whose homes burn down or get trapped in space or, are chased by serial killers, when they get back up, that gives us the skill to get back up. It's just that reminder.
I love that. The empathy is just so powerful. And this has been an awesome conversation. I loved every single minute of this, because really the power behind creating strong characters, that's so important. And this conversation just totally helped to kind of deep dive into that. So thank you so much, Eileen. This has been phenomenal. Where can people connect with you? Where can they get books? Because I know that you not just write the mysteries, but you also have nonfiction books on the craft itself. So
strangely enough, I wrote a book called Build Better Characters that is all psychological theories. So I walk you through different psychological theories. I give you the same intake form that I used to use with actual clients, and show you how you can use those to create, hopefully, characters that are a little bit three-dimensional. And you can find me real easily. That's the creativeacademyforwriters.com. It's an online group we have. It is free to join if people would like to join. We have weekly office hours, and we have different groups that are on there. So please join me there. And on my website, which is eileencook.com, you'll see a connect with me button. I do a monthly newsletter with fun prompts and various things. And then you can hopefully check out my fiction as well. So my most recent is You Owe Me a Murder, which is a retelling of Strangers on a Train set in a YA world. So
nice.
Very fun to do. So
very cool. Very, very cool. I like Patricia Highsmith. So very cool.
Patricia Highsmith.
Thank you so much, Eileen. This has been a blast.
Thank you so much. And I hope everyone just keep out writing. Remember, if you're on your hero's journey and it feels like a dark night of the soul, there's still another scene to come. So just keep writing.